sometimes it gets hard to keep in mind just how ignorant we are as a nation to what's going on in other places. I mean, also within our own country. But the dynamic between, one of the things I've talked about, and again, save your emails. What happened in southern Israel was barbaric. It was a war crime. One of the things that's important to take note of is that, and this in no way is meant to both sides this or equivocate or whatever, but understand as a consumer of media that one of the ways that our perspectives on these conflicts and what's going on is a function of just sort of like how much media attention is given to one side or the other. The stories that we have seen from Israel are horrific. But if Palestinians could speak English and you had dozens upon dozens of U.S. reporters in the Gaza Strip, the public's understanding and opinions of this conflict would be radically different in my mind.
And I will add, if the Palestinians were a different shade of skin tone, that's part of it too.
I think that's part of it. I mean, I think there's still like an element often of, I'm sure that's part of it. But I think even despite that, if Palestinians spoke more Palestinians, I'm not saying they should. I want people to understand. I'm just making it trying to argue that our understanding of this conflict is a function of the media coverage, and a lot of it. Racism still exists, of course. Here is a Fox and Friends, sort of almost like laying bare how people's ignorance plays into this in almost a hilarious. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic.
There's 18,000 day passes that Gaza residents could come into Israel and work. Obviously, that's been rescinded. They shut the power, they shut the water. So there was some semblance.
Pause it 1 second. Pause it. So I want to make something clear. Oh, sorry. Yeah, let me turn that down. Sorry. They're talking about the 18,000 day passes that Gazans had to come into Israel and work. Gaza is a completely blockaded island unto itself, with one road leading to Egypt where some supplies come in. But the idea that out of 2 million people, there are 18,000 daily workers who are allowed into Israel is some type of huge sort of like largesse is nuts.
Youth unemployment is 70%. So but
I think employment in general is 50%.
Thank you very much to the benevolent Israeli government for allowing a small percentage of Palestinians not to starve to death and make a wage.
But when you just throw that off, 18,000 passes, it sounds like, without any context, it sounds like a number, and it sounds like wow, they really hurt themselves by having somebody else attack the Israelis. But all right, continue.
Of cohabitation between them, even though a lot of people thought the border fence, which was a smart wall, was too much. Now you realize it wasn't enough.
Brian, explain this. If they hate Israel so much,
what is a smart wall?
They got out the sharper image.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. So smart, like the border fence. I mean, again, another lie here. We have to go lie by lie. Like the idea that this is a relationship between two people who can cohabitate. I saw somebody on who I was less familiar with on TYT, who this guy who did the dolphin fetus thing with Charlie Kirk, make some claim that that this is not a system of apartheid because the settlements in the West Bank and Gaza by the Israeli kind of right-wingers and fundamentalists mostly, that they're going into those areas to integrate, and that they're living side by side together. Now, that is similar to what you're hearing right now on Fox News, because that is not what that is. It is not a one-to-one relationship. One is the occupier and the other is the occupied.
And those settlements are just as often as not just built on literally on Palestinian land. But on top of which, I replay because I can't remember the point I wanted to make here. You just go back for 1 sec.
Fence, which was a smart wall, was too much.
The reason why he's trying to make it, he's talking about it as being a smart wall, is because one of the things that the Netanyahu government does not want to have to address, and part of the reason why I think this is going to be such a massive siege and attack on Gaza, is because they don't want to address this. Part of what they don't want to address is they didn't have many military personnel down at the border at all. And the reason is because they had moved soldiers up into the West Bank to essentially provide protection for these radical fundamentalist settlers who were dispossessing Palestinians of their homes in the West Bank. And they needed protection because people don't like to have literally the homes that they're living in taken from them by settlers. And that's what they were doing. They were literally up there protecting things like sukkahs in areas that sukkahs for a Jewish holiday build like a little what do you call it? Just almost like a trellis type of thing where to celebrate a holiday. Well, some of these fundamentalist Jews are up there, settlers are doing it on Palestinian land, and they had protection from the IDF to do this. And that's why there was no soldiers down there. So you try and make it sound like it was a smart fence. We didn't really need any people there. But no, in fact, they did. In my point being that, Israel has reached its capacity in terms of its ability to suppress the amount of people that they're suppressing. But continue.
Even though a lot of people thought the border fence, which was a smart wall, was too much. Now you realize it wasn't enough.
Brian, explain this. If they hate Israel so much, why would they rely on Israel for their power? Why is Israel shutting off their food, their power, their water, their fuel?
Well, I'm sure they never adjusted it.
Pause it. I mean, come on. Since 2007, Gaza has been under blockade, as Sam said earlier, with one road through Egypt that's also controlled by Egypt's borders as well. And Israel has been implementing a blockade. They're not allowing Israel to control their food, their electricity, their fuel, their water.
I mean, it's actually
Israel is imposing that on them since the blockade began, 18 years ago, 17 years ago.
This is the thing that Ainsley Earhardt it's a great question. Like, why would they do that?
You're so
they
close.
They didn't. That is exactly right. They did not. And the reason why Gaza doesn't have power now is because Israel has bombed out their power stations. And it has cut off any type of electricity that was running into Gaza. And like you say, they have cut off all supplies. But it is a great question. Why would they do that? And the answer is, they have no choice.
They made a bad deal.
Bad deal.
If they hate Israel so much, why would they rely on Israel for their power? Why is Israel shutting off their food, their power, their water, their fuel?
Well, I'm sure they never adjusted it. After Sharon gave it up in 2007, I think it was, they literally ripped, we covered it on our show. Jennifer Griffin was on the ground, and they were grabbing Israelis and ripping them out of their houses and giving them over to the Palestinians, which would turn out to be Hamas. And they told them, you're out. We're just giving this away. We're not even bargaining it. You can take it. So what they did, and I didn't realize this until they were able to do it, is we'll control your power and your water. Yeah. So, and
it was an agreement,
or they just did it. You know, when you give someone something, maybe held on something back.
We're going to be talking.
Now, I may be mistaken from this, but I think he's confusing the when the Israelis gave up the Negev desert to Egypt, as opposed to the Gaza Strip. In 2007, what Israel did is they stopped occupying the Gaza Strip. They didn't give it up. They just withdrew their forces in 2007. And I'm not even sure if that's the exact date. That is the date then and to be clear, the Israelis did this to empower Hamas in that moment because they wanted to have a divided Palestinian leadership. Much of the Palestinian leadership at that time was basically saying, don't do this unilaterally. Do not. And frankly, the Bush administration was also involved in pressuring this election because they either thought it was going to go the other way or they thought it would debilitate the ability of the Palestinian people to advocate for themselves in a unified voice. And in many respects, it worked. Can
you shed more light on that, actually, Sam, as someone who was, not working in this field during the Bush administration? What on his way out, with his approval rating being, one of the worst at that time that the president had in the midst of the Iraq War, what were the designs of the hawks in the Bush administration to broker this?
Okay. I'm quite sure it happened earlier. Okay. I think it happened in 2005 is when the Israel unilaterally disengaged from the Gaza Strip. And it was subsequent to that where the Bush administration was pushing for an election. And we should say, when the Israelis left in 2005, and I've got to brush up on this to be fair. So folks should at the very least check these dates. When Israel left, they had already completely gated it, essentially, the Gaza Strip, and it was done unilaterally. So there was no sort of working with the Palestinians because, look at how long it took us to get out of Afghanistan. And it's still, we left in Afghanistan a completely unstable civil society, which is why the Taliban was able to sweep in so quickly and take over, because there was nothing undergirding it. Once you come in and destroy something like that, and so unilateral disengagement was specifically to essentially to make sure that there was no opportunities for the Palestinians to build on any type of civil society in that. And Hamas, one of the reasons why, and we should say, I think they maybe got 45% of the vote, 17 years ago or something, or maybe
time elections
52.
were. Last time elections were even held.
Well, the only time elections were held, and there was a lot of Palestinians, particularly on the West Bank, and the Palestinian Authority at that time, which was sort of in Fatah, which is a rival group to Hamas, was like, we're not in a position to do this, because what Hamas was doing, in addition to the sort of terrorism military wing, if you will, different people will assess it in different ways. They also had a wing that was providing social services. And you're talking about immense poverty. You're talking about a complete absence of civil society, more or less. And the idea of a group coming in and providing things like, food assistance and mutual aid and whatnot, it's going to build a certain amount of goodwill within the country, just based upon the services in and of themselves.
And then pair that with the radicalizing when you're in, there's no economic opportunity. You're getting bombed. You're seeing the deaths of your family members.
Well, I'm not even saying that people necessarily become part of Hamas as much as like, oh, Hamas, that's that place where I get the food.
Right.
I mean, there's
not a lot of other options. It's like
there's not a lot of other options. We should also say that Hamas was, if not born, certainly sort of like midwifed in the same way that the U.S. Midwifed the Taliban. Because just as we saw the Taliban as a bulwark against the Soviet Union,
yep,
and much of what we're experiencing is blowback from that, what we did on 9/11, Israel in the 80s. I can't remember if it was the beginning or the end of the 80s, out of the Islamic Brotherhood, nurtured Hamas as a way of undercutting Fatah and the PLO. And we should say, Fatah and the PLO, secular organizations.
It's actually exactly out of the United States' playbook with the Mujahideen.
Yeah. And I don't know which predated which, to be honest with you. So I don't know whose playbook it was.
Well, true. But I mean, borrowing from each other. Yeah.
Similar playbook. And again, save your emails. This does not in any way excuse the actions taken by Hamas, but there are certain realities that exist, and 2 million of them are actual human beings living in Gaza. And when you go in and level neighborhoods and kill children and kill parents, you could root out every single existing Hamas fighter there is in Gaza, but you will create 3 others for every one that you kill, who will create some other group that will be just as difficult.
And this was the quote that I was looking for earlier in the show, but just want to read it again. Apparently, this is what Netanyahu told other Likud Knesset members in March 2019. Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. And I'm going to repeat that quote probably for infinity until we actually have some understanding about what we're up against here. And I sent you this thing that David Dayen retweeted, Bradley. If we could just put this up, I put this in chat, just to bring it back to what you were saying earlier, Sam, about our complete lack of understanding here from the way that U.S. media covers this versus even how it's covered from within Israel. We've now read multiple scathing Haaretz op-eds. I know Haaretz not the only paper in Israel, but it's a prominent one.
A paper of record.
A paper of record, just slamming Netanyahu and putting the attack of Hamas at his feet. Yeah. And it is collectively, seemingly, and this is the Jerusalem Post, which is not as not as left, I would say, as Haaretz. If we could just zoom out here. Dan here says, and this is exactly right, the contrast between the boundaries of discussion in the country that fetishizes allyship with Israel and the boundaries of discussion in the actual country of Israel couldn't be more stark. And this is from the Jerusalem Post. 4 out of 5 Jewish Israelis believe the government and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are to blame for the mass infiltration of Hamas terrorists and the massacre of Israel's South. And a New Dialogue Center poll released on Thursday found an overwhelming majority of 86% of respondents, including 79% of coalition supporters, said the surprise attack from Gaza is a failure of the country's leadership, while a staggering 92% said the war is causing anxiety. And so that is the ghost that Netanyahu is running away from right now. And that is why
100%.
And that
100%.
is why he will not let up, why they are bragging that they're not letting any food or water or electricity or fuel into Gaza right now, and that it will be indefinite. Because as long as every Palestinian is in some way connected to Hamas, as long as every Palestinian is associated with terrorism, it's so much easier to demonize them than for him to have to face any domestic reality and political consequences for his abject failure and his inflaming in his entire tenure as leader, even though he had that brief interim, we had a respite from that guy for a little while, but he's back and he's trying to erode any kind of guardrails in terms of the court systems, checks on his power domestically, and that is indelibly connected to the apartheid, to the occupation, which is turning inward both from the anti-democratic efforts that he's trying to impose and the violence turning inward, because that's always how it works.
And I saw images of Anthony Blinken was in Israel today, and the Israeli people, I think at least the ones that were there, were very racist. That same poll that you just cited there also said 92% of the country is incredibly anxious about what's going on there. I have no doubt about that. Whether real or perceived in terms of like the Israeli psyche feeling that there's always a vague existential threat going on. I can understand why they're happy to have Blinken there. It's a show of support, but it is, I can't help but think that, and I think it would be, I'd like to think that Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken behind closed doors are saying to, Netanyahu, you got 2 days and that's it. Or whatever it is, putting some type of limits on this. But I think the reality is that they are not, and that their seemingly complete absence of any conditions on the support or any discrimination as to what we will send in terms of military hardware, I think is appalling. Because we are not only standing aside, we are enabling what is increasingly looking like a mass killing of children and innocent people. I mean, we killed hundreds of thousands of innocents in Iraq. And if there's, an American who can remember or had ever even seen 2 images, 30 seconds of footage of that, maybe heard an Iraqi mother or father or child talk about the loss of their parents, that was longer than 30 seconds. Like, I mean, I feel like this room, it's a big room, but it's not that big, could fill every American who ever even saw something like that. It's going to be the same situation here. And the way that that's being ensured is because of the power and because of the complete blockade. And the idea that the U.S. government, in addition to being complicit because of the amount of weaponry we already provide Israel without any conditions, without using any of that as leverage to get them to treat the Palestinians like human beings, is just appalling. And I can't help but think that the reason why we're seeing Biden come out as such a vocal and unequivocal supporter of Israel's intentions in regards to the Gaza Strip. And I don't mean unequivocal support in terms of like condolences and denouncement of what Hamas is, but I'm saying unequivocal and unconditional support for what they're about to do and what they're doing in Gaza. the fact that we're seeing this so full-throated, I can't help but think is Biden trying to worrying about his 2024 election. I think that's like, a big part of what we're seeing. And because he wants to undercut Donald Trump's ability to say that Joe Biden doesn't stand with Israel. And now, Donald Trump is completely adrift.
They're saying it anyway, by the way. I mean, the right is all saying it anyway.